Aston Villa versus Sunderland, one of the Sunday 2 p.m. kickoffs. Aston Villa, as we've touched upon in the earlier videos, got through to the Europa League semi-finals where they'll play Crystal Palace in midweek. Sunderland have been the most impressive of the promoted teams. Really stopped the rot of the last few seasons of all the promoted teams just going straight back down. They'll look back on this as a really successful season. Not too much to fight for Sunderland, but for Aston Villa, there's still that Champions League place that they need to wrap up. They're not in good form. They are currently in fourth, and they've been in those Champions League positions for so long that it feels almost like they're a bit cemented in them, but they're not, are they? If they have a poor end to the season and one of the chasing pack has a good end to the season, then they could easily drop out of there still.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about the really exciting games this weekend. Of course, Merseyside Derby, City Arsenal. This has got the look of a really fascinating game as well. Of course, Villa, they're still fighting on those two fronts. One team, one English team is going to be in the Europa League final. I would back Villa. You could say Villa might be the favourites for it now. I'd back them to beat Forest, and then I'd back them to beat whoever they face in the final. But yeah, they could get Champions League that way. They could get Champions League via their league position. But yeah, it's been the inconsistency there. Obviously, Unai Emery's done a magnificent job, especially at Villa Park recently. I remember, yeah, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, they just couldn't stop winning at Villa Park. They had that record win streak, and even earlier this season, they won 8 games in a row at Villa Park. But it's just been two in their last six, I think. And I think with Villa, with a lot of teams playing on Thursday, then Sunday, there's always been this continental fatigue. Teams not winning games in the Premier League after winning in Europe. That's always been a bit of a sticking point for Villa. So we'll see if there's any European hangover from that one. But yeah, it was a really, really dominant win on Thursday. Morgan Rogers, Ollie Watkins back on the score sheet. Good time for Thomas Tuchel as well, heading into the World Cup. You'd expect Watkins. He's not had the most sensational season, but you still look at him as that natural number two to Harry Kane. Of course, Morgan Rogers will be battling the likes of, yeah, Cole Palmer, Saka for those attacking starts, and it looks like he'll be on the move this summer. So he's playing for not just his World Cup spot, but also his future. I was really curious to see last weekend before the Forest draw, Martinez pulling out of the starting lineup literally about 20 minutes before kickoff. And that was the third time that it had happened this season, which, for me, we said this word so much in COVID, it was unprecedented. A player pulling out of a starting lineup 3 times in a single season. And he was back on Thursday evening, but I saw some Villa fans saying, do you think when Martinez just cannot be bothered to play, he just fakes an injury and pulls out of the team? Of course, that's absolutely wild talk, and I'm sure it's not the case. But it is curious to see 3 separate warm-up injuries in a single season for a single player. So maybe that's something for Villa to look at in the summer. Do they need to maybe look at a Martinez successor if these little niggles keep on appearing? But yeah, Sunderland, like you say, Barney, one of the stories of the season. Europe's still not impossible for them. And this recruitment, of course, they brought in Granit Xhaka. Love to see him back in the Premier League. Was devastated when he left Arsenal just after his best season in Arsenal kit, 7 goals, 7 assists, and then had that amazing revival under Arteta after that Palace outburst. We all thought that's him done at Arsenal, but no, he revived his career, went to become a Bundesliga invincible, and has now led Sunderland to, yeah, what could be one of their best ever Premier League seasons. Been magnificent to see what he's done, and the likes of yeah, Dan Ballard, so many players, Robin Roos, Mukiele, Brian Brobby. We could talk about the Spurs, Romero, Kinski instant, but we won't. But yeah, the recruitment there has been absolutely top notch, and I think they've already won as many games themselves as all the 3 newly promoted clubs in the whole of last season did in the Premier League. I mean, if they got into Europe, that would be a magnificent story. But they've been a really, really refreshing addition to the Premier League, Sunderland.
Yeah, Oliver, we're looking at two clubs here who could end the season just having great seasons. Aston Villa if they finish in the top five or win a European trophy, and Sunderland if they finish in the top half of the Premier League. They'll both look back on these as hugely successful campaigns.
Yeah, for sure. I think, looking at Villa, they've sort of established themselves as one of these teams now that are regularly challenging for Europe. Not long ago, I guess less than 10 years ago, I think they're in the Championship, weren't they, with the likes of Jack Grealish and they've come up then. Eventually, they've got Unai Emery in charge, and they've just sort of elevated their level now in the Premier League under Emery, regularly competing for European spots. They're in the Champions League, and not long ago, they're likely to get in there again this season. So yeah, I think Villa are impressing. They've obviously got to the Europa League semi-final in quite convincing fashion on Thursday. In recent weeks, the form's actually not been that great. They're actually ranked 17th in the form table across the last six Premier League games. And as you mentioned before, likes of Watkins and Rodgers have suffered dips in form. So the fact that they scored on Thursday sort of gives them a bit of a boost coming into the fact, the home straight now. So yeah, for Villa, it's just sort of a matter of getting over the line in Europe, but also getting that top five spot for them. And as for Sunderland, as Ben said before, they've had such an impressive season, exceeding expectations by quite a bit this season. Again, another team that was sort of tipped to struggle, tipped to potentially go down, but after that sort of investing heavily in the summer, it's really paid off for them. And they've been, Regis Labrie, the manager, deserves huge credit for transforming this side after being sort of a mid-table team in the Championship to now a team that actually could qualify for Europe across about an 18-month period. So really impressive to see Sunderland rise in such a short space of time. And yeah, this game, Villa Sunderland's quite an interesting one. Could be a tight game, probably edge Villa if I had to choose, but yeah, it should be an interesting one between these two.
Yeah, and just going back to Villa, the sort of momentum and the perspective that gives people always fascinates me in football. Like in my head, Villa aren't in, well, they're not in good form at the moment. But if you just took a snapshot of the season, didn't say anything about form, level on points with third place Manchester United in those Champions League places in the European semi-final, it's been an incredible season. And if they had had things the other way round and they'd had their current run of sort of poor form in October and then been on a good form to get into this position, a lot of people would be singing all their praises, whereas there's a little bit more criticism than perhaps their overall league position deserves at the moment for them.